The new god of Sinmoreness. The new gods of Sinmoreness. The new god of Sinmoreness. The new goddess of Sinmoreness. The new goddesses of Sinmoreness. The new goddess of Sinmoreness. The old god of Sinmoreness. The old gods of Sinmoreness. The old god of Sinmoreness. The old goddess of Sinmoreness. The old goddesses of Sinmoreness. The old goddess of Sinmoreness. The greater god of Sinmoreness. The greater gods of Sinmoreness. The greater god of Sinmoreness. The greater goddess of Sinmoreness. The greater goddesses of Sinmoreness. The greater goddess of Sinmoreness. The lesser god of Sinmoreness. The lesser gods of Sinmoreness. The lesser god of Sinmoreness. The lesser goddess of Sinmoreness. The lesser goddesses of Sinmoreness. The lesser goddess of Sinmoreness. The higher god of Sinmoreness. The higher gods of Sinmoreness. The higher god of Sinmoreness. The higher goddess of Sinmoreness. The higher goddesses of Sinmoreness. The higher goddess of Sinmoreness. The lower god of Sinmoreness. The lower gods of Sinmoreness. The lower god of Sinmoreness. The lower goddess of Sinmoreness. The lower goddesses of Sinmoreness. The lower goddess of Sinmoreness. The greater spirit of Sinmoreness. The greater spirits of Sinmoreness. The greater spirit of Sinmoreness. The lesser spirit of Sinmoreness. The lesser spirits of Sinmoreness. The lesser spirit of Sinmoreness. The higher spirit of Sinmoreness. The higher spirits of Sinmoreness. The higher spirit of Sinmoreness. The lower spirit of Sinmoreness. The lower spirits of Sinmoreness. The lower spirit of Sinmoreness. The major god of Sinmoreness. The major gods of Sinmoreness. The major god of Sinmoreness. The major goddess of Sinmoreness. The major goddesses of Sinmoreness. The major goddess of Sinmoreness. The minor god of Sinmoreness. The minor gods of Sinmoreness. The minor god of Sinmoreness. The minor goddess of Sinmoreness. The minor goddesses of Sinmoreness. The minor goddess of Sinmoreness. The superior god of Sinmoreness. The superior gods of Sinmoreness. The superior god of Sinmoreness. The superior goddess of Sinmoreness. The superior goddesses of Sinmoreness. The superior goddess of Sinmoreness. The inferior god of Sinmoreness. The inferior gods of Sinmoreness. The inferior god of Sinmoreness. The inferior goddess of Sinmoreness. The inferior goddesses of Sinmoreness. The inferior goddess of Sinmoreness. The ancestor god of Sinmoreness. The ancestor gods of Sinmoreness. The ancestor god of Sinmoreness. The ancestor goddess of Sinmoreness. The ancestor goddesses of Sinmoreness. The ancestor goddess of Sinmoreness. The ascendant god of Sinmoreness. The ascendant gods of Sinmoreness. The ascendant god of Sinmoreness. The ascendant goddess of Sinmoreness. The ascendant goddesses of Sinmoreness. The ascendant goddess of Sinmoreness. The descendant god of Sinmoreness. The descendant gods of Sinmoreness. The descendant god of Sinmoreness. The descendant goddess of Sinmoreness. The descendant goddesses of Sinmoreness. The descendant goddess of Sinmoreness. The transcendent god of Sinmoreness. The transcendent gods of Sinmoreness. The transcendent god of Sinmoreness. The transcendent goddess of Sinmoreness. The transcendent goddesses of Sinmoreness. The transcendent goddess of Sinmoreness. The past god of Sinmoreness. The past gods of Sinmoreness. The past god of Sinmoreness. The past goddess of Sinmoreness. The past goddesses of Sinmoreness. The past goddess of Sinmoreness. The present god of Sinmoreness. The present gods of Sinmoreness. The present god of Sinmoreness. The present goddess of Sinmoreness. The present goddesses of Sinmoreness. The present goddess of Sinmoreness. The future god of Sinmoreness. The future gods of Sinmoreness. The future god of Sinmoreness. The future goddess of Sinmoreness. The future goddesses of Sinmoreness. The future goddess of Sinmoreness. The authentic god of Sinmoreness. The authentic gods of Sinmoreness. The authentic god of Sinmoreness. The authentic goddess of Sinmoreness. The authentic goddesses of Sinmoreness. The authentic goddess of Sinmoreness. The synthetic god of Sinmoreness. The synthetic gods of Sinmoreness. The synthetic god of Sinmoreness. The synthetic goddess of Sinmoreness. The synthetic goddesses of Sinmoreness. The synthetic goddess of Sinmoreness. The progressive god of Sinmoreness. The progressive gods of Sinmoreness. the progressive god of Sinmoreness, the progressive goddess of Sinmoreness, the progressive goddesses of Sinmoreness, the progressive goddess of Sinmoreness, the regressive god of Sinmoreness, the regressive gods of Sinmoreness, the regressive god of Sinmoreness, the regressive goddess of Sinmoreness, the regressive goddesses of Sinmoreness, the regressive goddess of Sinmoreness, the ordinary god of Sinmoreness, the ordinary gods of Sinmoreness, the ordinary god of Sinmoreness, the ordinary goddess of Sinmoreness, the ordinary goddesses of Sinmoreness, the ordinary goddess of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary god of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary gods of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary god of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary goddess of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary goddesses of Sinmoreness, the extraordinary goddess of Sinmoreness, the static god of Sinmoreness, the static gods of Sinmoreness, the static god of Sinmoreness, the static goddess of Sinmoreness, the static goddesses of Sinmoreness, the static goddess of Sinmoreness, the dynamic god of Sinmoreness, the dynamic gods of Sinmoreness, the dynamic god of Sinmoreness, the dynamic goddess of Sinmoreness, the dynamic goddesses of Sinmoreness, the dynamic goddess of Sinmoreness, the land god of Sinmoreness, the land gods of Sinmoreness, the land god of Sinmoreness, the land goddess of Sinmoreness, the land goddesses of Sinmoreness, the land goddess of Sinmoreness, the sea god of Sinmoreness, the sea gods of Sinmoreness, the sea god of Sinmoreness, the sea goddess of Sinmoreness, the sea goddesses of Sinmoreness, the sea goddess of Sinmoreness, the sky god of Sinmoreness, the sky gods of Sinmoreness, the sky god of Sinmoreness, the sky goddess of Sinmoreness, the sky goddesses of Sinmoreness, the sky goddess of Sinmoreness, the god of Sinmoreness, the gods of Sinmoreness, the god of Sinmoreness, the goddess of Sinmoreness, the goddesses of Sinmoreness, the goddess of Sinmoreness, the half-god of Sinmoreness, the half-gods of Sinmoreness, the half-god of Sinmoreness, the half-goddess of Sinmoreness, the half-goddesses of Sinmoreness, the half-goddess of Sinmoreness, the vessel of Sinmoreness, the vessels of Sinmoreness, the vessel of Sinmoreness, the name of Sinmoreness, the names of Sinmoreness, the name of Sinmoreness, the person of Sinmoreness, the persons of Sinmoreness, the person of Sinmoreness, the persona of Sinmoreness, the personas of Sinmoreness, the persona of Sinmoreness, the personage of Sinmoreness, the personages of Sinmoreness, the personage of Sinmoreness, the personality of Sinmoreness, the personalities of Sinmoreness, the personality of Sinmoreness, the personification of Sinmoreness, the personifications of Sinmoreness, the personification of Sinmoreness, the image of Sinmoreness, the images of Sinmoreness, the image of Sinmoreness, the imagination of Sinmoreness, the imaginations of Sinmoreness, the imagination of Sinmoreness, the belief of Sinmoreness, the beliefs of Sinmoreness, the belief of Sinmoreness, the thought of Sinmoreness, the thoughts of Sinmoreness, the thought of Sinmoreness, the word of Sinmoreness, the words of Sinmoreness, the word of Sinmoreness, the action of Sinmoreness, the actions of Sinmoreness, the action of Sinmoreness, the reaction of Sinmoreness, the reactions of Sinmoreness, the reaction of Sinmoreness, the feeling of Sinmoreness, the feelings of Sinmoreness, the feeling of Sinmoreness, the situation of Sinmoreness, the situations of Sinmoreness, the situation of Sinmoreness, the circumstance of Sinmoreness, the circumstances of Sinmoreness, the circumstance of Sinmoreness, the environment of Sinmoreness, the environments of Sinmoreness, the environment of Sinmoreness, the relationship of Sinmoreness, the relationships of Sinmoreness, the relationship of Sinmoreness, the number of Sinmoreness, the numbers of Sinmoreness, the number of Sinmoreness, the formula of Sinmoreness, the formulas of Sinmoreness, the formula of Sinmoreness, the equation of Sinmoreness, the equations of Sinmoreness, the equation of Sinmoreness, the theory of Sinmoreness, the theories of Sinmoreness, the theory of Sinmoreness, the symbol of Sinmoreness, the symbols of Sinmoreness, the symbol of Sinmoreness, the color of Sinmoreness, the colors of Sinmoreness, the color of Sinmoreness, the thing of Sinmoreness, the things of Sinmoreness, the thing of Sinmoreness, the way of Sinmoreness, the ways of Sinmoreness, the way of Sinmoreness, the place of Sinmoreness, the places of Sinmoreness, the place of Sinmoreness, the time of Sinmoreness, the times of Sinmoreness, the time of Sinmoreness, the event of Sinmoreness, the events of Sinmoreness, the event of Sinmoreness, the result of Sinmoreness, the results of Sinmoreness, the result of Sinmoreness, the crown of Sinmoreness, the crowns of Sinmoreness, the crown of Sinmoreness, the throne of Sinmoreness, the thrones of Sinmoreness, the throne of Sinmoreness, the Sinmoreness king, the Sinmoreness kings, the Sinmoreness kingdom, the Sinmoreness kingdoms, the Sinmoreness king's subject, the Sinmoreness king's subjects, the Sinmoreness king's dominion, the Sinmoreness king's dominions, the kingdom of Sinmoreness, the kingdoms of Sinmoreness, the kingdom of Sinmoreness, the Sinmoreness queen, the Sinmoreness queens, the Sinmoreness queendom, the Sinmoreness queendoms, the Sinmoreness queen's subject, the Sinmoreness queen's subjects, the Sinmoreness queen's dominion, the Sinmoreness queen's dominions, the queendom of Sinmoreness, the queendoms of Sinmoreness, the queendom of Sinmoreness, the Sinmoreness prince, the Sinmoreness princes, the Sinmoreness princedom, the Sinmoreness princedoms, the Sinmoreness prince's subject, the Sinmoreness prince's subjects, the Sinmoreness prince's dominion, the Sinmoreness prince's dominions, the princedom of Sinmoreness, the princedoms of Sinmoreness, the princedom of Sinmoreness, the Sinmoreness princess, the Sinmoreness princesses, the Sinmoreness princessdom, the Sinmoreness princessdoms, the Sinmoreness princess's subject, the Sinmoreness princess's subjects, the Sinmoreness princess's dominion, the Sinmoreness princess's dominions, the princessdom of Sinmoreness, the princessdoms of Sinmoreness, the princessdom of Sinmoreness, the lord of Sinmoreness, the lords of Sinmoreness, the lord of Sinmoreness, the lordess of Sinmoreness, the lordesses of Sinmoreness, the lordess of Sinmoreness, the priest of Sinmoreness, the priests of Sinmoreness, the priest of Sinmoreness, the priestess of Sinmoreness, the priestesses of Sinmoreness, the priestess of Sinmoreness, the ritual of Sinmoreness, the rituals of Sinmoreness, the ritual of Sinmoreness, the shrine of Sinmoreness, the shrines of Sinmoreness, the shrine of Sinmoreness, the temple of Sinmoreness, the temples of Sinmoreness, the temple of Sinmoreness, the leader of Sinmoreness, the leaders of Sinmoreness, the leader of Sinmoreness, the follower of Sinmoreness, the followers of Sinmoreness, the follower of Sinmoreness, the natural substance of Sinmoreness, the natural substances of Sinmoreness, the natural substance of Sinmoreness, the supernatural substance of Sinmoreness, the supernatural substances of Sinmoreness, the supernatural substance of Sinmoreness, the temporal substance of Sinmoreness, the temporal substances of Sinmoreness, the temporal substance of Sinmoreness, the spiritual substance of Sinmoreness, the spiritual substances of Sinmoreness, the spiritual substance of Sinmoreness, the natural form of Sinmoreness, the natural forms of Sinmoreness, the natural form of Sinmoreness, the supernatural form of Sinmoreness, the supernatural forms of Sinmoreness, the supernatural form of Sinmoreness, the temporal form of Sinmoreness, the temporal forms of Sinmoreness, the temporal form of Sinmoreness, the spiritual form of Sinmoreness, the spiritual forms of Sinmoreness, the spiritual form of Sinmoreness, the age of Sinmoreness, the ages of Sinmoreness, the age of Sinmoreness, the era of Sinmoreness, the heiress of Sinmoreness, the era of Sinmoreness, the awakener of Sinmoreness, the awakeners of Sinmoreness, the awakener of Sinmoreness, the awakening of Sinmoreness, the awakenings of Sinmoreness, the awakening of Sinmoreness, the realm of Sinmoreness, the realms of Sinmoreness, the realm of Sinmoreness, the dimension of Sinmoreness, the dimensions of Sinmoreness, the dimension of Sinmoreness, the zone of Sinmoreness, the zones of Sinmoreness, the zone of Sinmoreness, The frequency of Sinmoreness. The frequencies of Sinmoreness. The frequency of Sinmoreness. The century of Sinmoreness. The centuries of Sinmoreness. The century of Sinmoreness. The millennium of Sinmoreness. The millenniums of Sinmoreness. The millennium of Sinmoreness. The purpose of Sinmoreness. The purposes of Sinmoreness. The purpose of Sinmoreness. The meaning of Sinmoreness. The meanings of Sinmoreness. The meaning of Sinmoreness. The culture of Sinmoreness. The cultures of Sinmoreness. The culture of Sinmoreness. The demonstrator of Sinmoreness. The demonstrators of Sinmoreness. The demonstrator of Sinmoreness. The demonstration of Sinmoreness. The demonstrations of Sinmoreness. The demonstration of Sinmoreness. The manifester of Sinmoreness. The manifestors of Sinmoreness. The manifester of Sinmoreness. The manifestation of Sinmoreness. The manifestations of Sinmoreness. The manifestation of Sinmoreness. The presence of Sinmoreness. The presences of Sinmoreness. The presence of Sinmoreness. The glow of Sinmoreness. The glows of Sinmoreness. The glow of Sinmoreness. The goal of Sinmoreness. The goals of Sinmoreness. The goal of Sinmoreness. The plan of Sinmoreness. The plans of Sinmoreness. The plan of Sinmoreness. The book of Sinmoreness. The books of Sinmoreness. The book of Sinmoreness. The philosopher of Sinmoreness. The philosophers of Sinmoreness. The philosopher of Sinmoreness. The philosophy of Sinmoreness. The philosophies of Sinmoreness. The philosophy of Sinmoreness. The releaser of Sinmoreness. The releasers of Sinmoreness. The releaser of Sinmoreness. The release of Sinmoreness. The releases of Sinmoreness. The release of Sinmoreness. The variable of Sinmoreness. The variables of Sinmoreness. The variable of Sinmoreness. The cause of Sinmoreness. The causes of Sinmoreness. The cause of Sinmoreness. The effect of Sinmoreness. The effects of Sinmoreness. The effect of Sinmoreness. The journey of Sinmoreness. The journeys of Sinmoreness. The journey of Sinmoreness. The emergence of Sinmoreness. The emergences of Sinmoreness. The emergence of Sinmoreness. The source of Sinmoreness. The sources of Sinmoreness. The source of Sinmoreness. The originator of Sinmoreness. The originators of Sinmoreness. The originator of Sinmoreness. The origin of Sinmoreness. The origins of Sinmoreness. The origin of Sinmoreness. The forefather of Sinmoreness. The forefathers of Sinmoreness. The forefather of Sinmoreness. The foremother of Sinmoreness. The foremothers of Sinmoreness. The foremother of Sinmoreness. The ancestor of Sinmoreness. The ancestors of Sinmoreness. The ancestor of Sinmoreness. The descendant of Sinmoreness. The descendants of Sinmoreness. The descendant of Sinmoreness. The lineage of Sinmoreness. The lineages of Sinmoreness. The lineage of Sinmoreness. The heritage of Sinmoreness. The heritages of Sinmoreness. The heritage of Sinmoreness. The heir of Sinmoreness. The heirs of Sinmoreness. The heir of Sinmoreness. The co-heir of Sinmoreness. The co-heirs of Sinmoreness. The co-heir of Sinmoreness. The joint heir of Sinmoreness. The joint heirs of Sinmoreness. The joint heir of Sinmoreness. The dynasty of Sinmoreness. The dynasties of Sinmoreness. The dynasty of Sinmoreness. The force of Sinmoreness. The forces of Sinmoreness. The force of Sinmoreness. The law of Sinmoreness. The laws of Sinmoreness. The law of Sinmoreness. The pact of Sinmoreness. The pacts of Sinmoreness. The pact of Sinmoreness. The game of Sinmoreness. The games of Sinmoreness. The game of Sinmoreness. The mask of Sinmoreness. The masks of Sinmoreness. The mask of Sinmoreness. The armor of Sinmoreness. The armors of Sinmoreness. The armor of Sinmoreness. The sword of Sinmoreness. The swords of Sinmoreness. The sword of Sinmoreness. The shield of Sinmoreness. The shields of Sinmoreness. The shield of Sinmoreness. The force shield of Sinmoreness. The force shields of Sinmoreness. The force shield of Sinmoreness. The armored force shield of Sinmoreness. The armored force shields of Sinmoreness. The armored force shield of Sinmoreness. The champion of Sinmoreness. The champions of Sinmoreness. The champion of Sinmoreness. The guardian of Sinmoreness. The guardians of Sinmoreness. the guardian of Sinmoreness, the defender of Sinmoreness, the defenders of Sinmoreness, the defender of Sinmoreness, the protector of Sinmoreness, the protectors of Sinmoreness, the protector of Sinmoreness, the chant of Sinmoreness, the chants of Sinmoreness, the chant of Sinmoreness, the shape of Sinmoreness, the shapes of Sinmoreness, the shape of Sinmoreness, the cube of Sinmoreness, the cubes of Sinmoreness, the cube of Sinmoreness, the cuboid of Sinmoreness, the cuboids of Sinmoreness, the cuboid of Sinmoreness, the sphere of Sinmoreness, the spheres of Sinmoreness, the sphere of Sinmoreness, the spheroid of Sinmoreness, the spheroids of Sinmoreness, the spheroid of Sinmoreness, the prism of Sinmoreness, the prisms of Sinmoreness, the prism of Sinmoreness, the pyramid of Sinmoreness, the pyramids of Sinmoreness, the pyramid of Sinmoreness, the cylinder of Sinmoreness, the cylinders of Sinmoreness, the cylinder of Sinmoreness, the cone of Sinmoreness, the cones of Sinmoreness, the cone of Sinmoreness, the triangle of Sinmoreness, the triangles of Sinmoreness, the triangle of Sinmoreness, the circle of Sinmoreness, the circles of Sinmoreness, the circle of Sinmoreness, the semicircle of Sinmoreness, the semicircles of Sinmoreness, the semicircle of Sinmoreness, the square of Sinmoreness, the squares of Sinmoreness, the square of Sinmoreness, the rectangle of Sinmoreness, the rectangles of Sinmoreness, the rectangle of Sinmoreness, the parallelogram of Sinmoreness, the parallelograms of Sinmoreness, the parallelogram of Sinmoreness, the rhombus of Sinmoreness, the rhombuses of Sinmoreness, the rhombus of Sinmoreness, the trapezoid of Sinmoreness, the trapezoids of Sinmoreness, the trapezoid of Sinmoreness, the polygon of Sinmoreness, the polygons of Sinmoreness, the polygon of Sinmoreness, the pentagon of Sinmoreness, the pentagons of Sinmoreness, the pentagon of Sinmoreness, the hexagon of Sinmoreness, the hexagons of Sinmoreness, the hexagon of Sinmoreness, the septagon of Sinmoreness, the septagons of Sinmoreness, the septagon of Sinmoreness, the octagon of Sinmoreness, the octagons of Sinmoreness, the octagon of Sinmoreness, the nonagon of Sinmoreness, the nonagons of Sinmoreness, the nonagon of Sinmoreness, the decagon of Sinmoreness, the decagons of Sinmoreness, the decagon of Sinmoreness, the evolution of Sinmoreness, the evolutions of Sinmoreness, the evolution of Sinmoreness, the revolution of Sinmoreness, the revolutions of Sinmoreness, the revolution of Sinmoreness, the elemental art of Sinmoreness, the elemental arts of Sinmoreness, the elemental art of Sinmoreness, the elemental science of Sinmoreness, the elemental sciences of Sinmoreness, the elemental science of Sinmoreness, the elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the elemental principles of Sinmoreness, the elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the elemental technologies of Sinmoreness, the elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the low elemental art of Sinmoreness, the low elemental arts of Sinmoreness, the low elemental art of Sinmoreness, the low elemental science of Sinmoreness, the low elemental sciences of Sinmoreness, the low elemental science of Sinmoreness, the low elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the low elemental principles of Sinmoreness, the low elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the low elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the low elemental technologies of Sinmoreness, the low elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the high elemental art of Sinmoreness, the high elemental arts of Sinmoreness, the high elemental art of Sinmoreness, the high elemental science of Sinmoreness, the high elemental sciences of Sinmoreness, the high elemental science of Sinmoreness, the high elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the high elemental principles of Sinmoreness, the high elemental principle of Sinmoreness, the high elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the high elemental technologies of Sinmoreness, the high elemental technology of Sinmoreness, the agent of Sinmoreness, the agents of Sinmoreness, the agent of Sinmoreness, the agency of Sinmoreness, the agencies of Sinmoreness, the agency of Sinmoreness, the amplifier of Sinmoreness, the amplifiers of Sinmoreness, the amplifier of Sinmoreness, the amplification of Sinmoreness, The amplifications of Sinmoreness. The amplification of Sinmoreness. The enhancer of Sinmoreness. The enhancers of Sinmoreness. The enhancer of Sinmoreness. The enhancement of Sinmoreness. The enhancements of Sinmoreness. The enhancement of Sinmoreness. The magnifier of Sinmoreness. The magnifiers of Sinmoreness. The magnifier of Sinmoreness. The magnification of Sinmoreness. The magnifications of Sinmoreness. The magnification of Sinmoreness. The influencer of Sinmoreness. The influencers of Sinmoreness. The influencer of Sinmoreness. The influence of Sinmoreness. The influences of Sinmoreness. The influence of Sinmoreness. The emanator of Sinmoreness. The emanators of Sinmoreness. The emanator of Sinmoreness. The emanation of Sinmoreness. The emanations of Sinmoreness. The emanation of Sinmoreness. The converger of Sinmoreness. The convergers of Sinmoreness. The converger of Sinmoreness. The convergence of Sinmoreness. The convergences of Sinmoreness. The convergence of Sinmoreness. The aura of Sinmoreness. The auras of Sinmoreness. The aura of Sinmoreness. The impression of Sinmoreness. The impressions of Sinmoreness. The impression of Sinmoreness. The intelligence of Sinmoreness. The intelligences of Sinmoreness. The intelligence of Sinmoreness. The sophistication of Sinmoreness. The sophistications of Sinmoreness. The sophistication of Sinmoreness. The genius of Sinmoreness. The geniuses of Sinmoreness. The genius of Sinmoreness. The polymath of Sinmoreness. The polymaths of Sinmoreness. The polymath of Sinmoreness. The psychic of Sinmoreness. The psychics of Sinmoreness. The psychic of Sinmoreness. The knowledge of Sinmoreness. The knowledges of Sinmoreness. The knowledge of Sinmoreness. The understanding of Sinmoreness. The understandings of Sinmoreness. The understanding of Sinmoreness. The wisdom of Sinmoreness. The wisdoms of Sinmoreness. The wisdom of Sinmoreness. The secret of Sinmoreness. The secrets of Sinmoreness. The secret of Sinmoreness. The mystery of Sinmoreness. The mysteries of Sinmoreness. The mystery of Sinmoreness. The revelation of Sinmoreness. The revelations of Sinmoreness. The revelation of Sinmoreness. The tactic of Sinmoreness. The tactics of Sinmoreness. The tactic of Sinmoreness. The strategy of Sinmoreness. The strategies of Sinmoreness. The strategy of Sinmoreness. The strength of Sinmoreness. The strengths of Sinmoreness. The strength of Sinmoreness. The might of Sinmoreness. The mights of Sinmoreness. The might of Sinmoreness. The power of Sinmoreness. The powers of Sinmoreness. The power of Sinmoreness. The authority of Sinmoreness. The authorities of Sinmoreness. The authority of Sinmoreness. The dominion of Sinmoreness. The dominions of Sinmoreness. The dominion of Sinmoreness. The rhythm of Sinmoreness. The rhythms of Sinmoreness. The rhythm of Sinmoreness. The melody of Sinmoreness. The melodies of Sinmoreness. The melody of Sinmoreness. The music of Sinmoreness. The musics of Sinmoreness. The music of Sinmoreness. The lyric of Sinmoreness. The lyrics of Sinmoreness. The lyric of Sinmoreness. The song of Sinmoreness. The songs of Sinmoreness. The song of Sinmoreness. The dance of Sinmoreness. The dances of Sinmoreness. The dance of Sinmoreness. The spirit of Sinmoreness. The spirits of Sinmoreness. The spirit of Sinmoreness. The soul of Sinmoreness. The souls of Sinmoreness. The soul of Sinmoreness. The body of Sinmoreness. The bodies of Sinmoreness. The body of Sinmoreness. The mark of Sinmoreness. The marks of Sinmoreness. The mark of Sinmoreness. The promise of Sinmoreness. The promises of Sinmoreness. The promise of Sinmoreness. The visionary of Sinmoreness. The visionaries of Sinmoreness. The visionary of Sinmoreness. The vision of Sinmoreness. The visions of Sinmoreness. The vision of Sinmoreness. The picture of Sinmoreness. The pictures of Sinmoreness. The picture of Sinmoreness. The sound of Sinmoreness. The sounds of Sinmoreness. The sound of Sinmoreness. The dung of Sinmoreness. The dungs of Sinmoreness. The dung of Sinmoreness. The language of Sinmoreness. The languages of Sinmoreness. The language of Sinmoreness. The communication of Sinmoreness. The communications of Sinmoreness. The communication of Sinmoreness. The people of Sinmoreness. The peoples of Sinmoreness. The people of Sinmoreness. The society of Sinmoreness. The societies of Sinmoreness. The society of Sinmoreness. The fortress of Sinmoreness. The fortresses of Sinmoreness. The fortress of Sinmoreness. The government of Sinmoreness. The governments of Sinmoreness. The government of Sinmoreness. The city of Sinmoreness. The cities of Sinmoreness. The city of Sinmoreness. The nation of Sinmoreness. The nations of Sinmoreness. The nation of Sinmoreness. The civilization of Sinmoreness. The civilizations of Sinmoreness. The civilization of Sinmoreness. The world of Sinmoreness. The worlds of Sinmoreness. The world of Sinmoreness.